Good morning. My name is Kate Fassett, and I'm your worship associate today. Thank you for being here with me on my first time doing a reflection. In late September of 1990, when I was a week or two into starting 8th grade, I went to spend the night at my best friend's house. It was a Saturday night. We slept out on her deck. It was really hot. We woke up early when the sun hit our faces, and as we were rolling into a sleepy Sunday, my mom drove up to the house. She'd been crying. She told me my brother, at age 23 at the time, was in the hospital, and we packed up quickly to go there. In my mom's way, she didn't want to scare me with too many details. In my way, I knew things were much worse than her words. Your brother was in a motorcycle accident, was all she said, and tried to focus on driving. It was truly all a blur. The moments between arriving at Emmanuel's trauma ICU, walking down the wide hallways, and then seeing my brother on this noisy sand and airbed with pigskin pinned to his face. I remember the needles sticking out of his face, sort of like acupuncture needles, holding it in place. I'm not sure why the pigskin is the most prominent memory. I can't remember his body, but the pigskin and the ventilator, those were memorable. Being thrown off the back of a motorcycle into the woods broke my brother's neck. He sustained a C4-5 spinal cord injury. Our family would often explain to people, it's an injury like Superman, Christopher Reeves, but a little better. He can breathe on his own. As I moved through the fall of 8th grade, it was a life half spent at home and half spent at the hospital. Our church brought us meals for months, and I'll never forget that. That's why I love to cook for all of you. Through this blurry time, my brother then transitioned to inpatient rehab, Rio at Good Sam. My friends and I cartwheeled down hallways and sky bridges in the evenings while my parents did important things for my brother. Eventually, my brother came home, and so did a caregiver who lived with us for many months. My parents and I moved our bedrooms downstairs, and the caregiver and my brother lived upstairs, creating a new normal in our home. He stayed with us a long time. He was weird. I was a teenager starting high school. Over the years, my brother moved through many iterations of attempts at independence and evolving caregiving needs. He returned to the U of O, where he started his degree, finished with a degree in landscape architecture, with a focus on creating accessible landscapes in parks and public spaces. He lived with a bunch of great friends who rotated shifts in providing caregiving. He then moved into a home in West Lynn, ended up marrying one of his caregivers, had a child who's now 11, and then got divorced. My brother's life has never been comfortable or without emotional or physical pain, but there has been joy. We have celebrated, laughed, talked, so much talking. You would all love my brother if you met him. He's like sunshine. He draws you in. His caregivers care really deeply for him, the way I do, the way our family does. And there's a beauty in life of someone who has to rely on others for the smallest things. Picking up your glasses when they fall in your lap, wiping the sweat off your brow, giving him yet another scoop of chew. I was the best trained teenager and young adult in scooping up the exact right amount of chewing tobacco for my brother. Shoving a slice of pizza or a burger into the rigid pinch between his thumb and the side of his palm. He used to have some control over one of the muscles back here. My brother has lived so many lives in his time, has touched so many people's lives, with his listening ear. He's not well now. His lung infection is taking over in a way that may not be treatable. And yet we still talk. We still connect. We move through it. And I'll tell you, it really sucks. It sucks because he has an 11-year-old kiddo. His son is young and a bit unruly, but he's my nephew and I love him. We'll have as many moments of love and connection as possible, while knowing that my brother has outlived his life expectancy. We're lucky to have had him this long. A little gratitude here, switching gears. Today I am especially grateful for our OWL teachers. I'll tell you why. Talking about everything they do in OWL, not comfortable for me. And both of our girls have gone through the program, and it's been fantastic. And so I just would like to give a shout out and a big gratitude to all of those OWL teachers.
Our reading today, just for you, Brian, is Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clear blue air are headed home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. My best friend Darby has a tendency that she and I share to look on the bright side of things. Something went wrong. There must be a lesson in it somewhere. My purse got stolen. At least my camera wasn't in it. The ending of our respective marriages. These will build resiliency in our children when they get their own hearts broken. Most of our various struggles will give our children life lessons that they don't learn when their parents never struggle. This tendency of hers at always looking on the bright side led one of her other friends to quip, "Darby, even your toilet bowl has a silver lining." But every so often, that looking on the bright side begins to feel like an occupational hazard. Sometimes I just want to sit in the shadows for a while and lick my wounds. The sermon is based on one that I originally wrote in 2014. It's fun to come back to the topic now and realize how differently my children adapted to the struggles that we went through. My younger daughter, Marcella, who is now 22 and living in Rhode Island, came home from high school one day. She went to Grant, and Grant, which is in the Irvington neighborhood in Portland, was located at 92nd and Powell at the old Marshall High School for a while, and that was much closer to our house. And she was complaining that her high school friends, most of whom lived in those really nice neighborhoods, were absolutely shocked at the sight of homeless people. "I'm so glad we live where we do, Mom. I feel like I have a much better sense of the world than a lot of my friends do." There was a story I saw called The Inbox. A man was checking his inbox and found a note from a social service organization that he volunteered with. They were looking for a volunteer to do a life review for a man in his mid-30s who had terminal cancer and a young child. This man and his wife wanted someone to help them organize a scrapbook of his life so his child could know him, even though he wouldn't be alive to see him grow up. The moral of the story was, if you're ever feeling sorry for yourself, check your inbox. Someone has it much worse than you do. It is good to remember those privileges that we do have. It is good to be grateful for all that we do have. For our health and our children and food to eat and community to gather in. If we are not in the midst of extreme pain or grief right now, but just dealing with everyday troubles, it is good to be grateful. And yet, one of my standard lines is, just because someone somewhere has a brain tumor doesn't mean you never get to complain about your headache. Right now, I have a bad cold. I think it is the first cold I have had since 2020. I feel pretty crappy, and it's okay. How do we sit on that balance of being grateful and still being human? Of realizing that we are mostly lucky people with most of what we need and lots of what we want, and still allow ourselves to feel pain, to be human, to admit that sometimes things are just damn hard. There's a poem by Dorothy Neal MacDonald. I've heard it described as a wedding blessing. We do not wish you joy without sorrow, nor endless day without the healing dark, nor brilliant sun without the restful shadow, nor tides that never turn against your bark. We wish you love and strength and faith and wisdom, goods, gold enough to help some needy one. We wish you songs, but also blessed silence, and God's sweet peace when every day is done. I am sure that in the time before computers, ministers used to sit in their studies, researching topics for sermons in their libraries of books, trying to remember in what anthology of poetry that remembered snippet is from. But as I Googled that snippet from my laptop, I was surprised to find that the first hit returned was the online obituary of one Ruth Lenz, born in Minnesota in 1911, died in California in 1998. Like many people, Ruth's life was both ordinary and extraordinary. When she was a little girl, she thought she was special because her birthday was bookended between George Washington's and Abraham Lincoln's, though that feeling of specialness was quaffed by the move to celebrating Monday holidays. Ruth worked as a telephone operator at age 14. She graduated as valedictorian and class president in a class of 11. She became a teacher and later married a man of the soil who, in the words of the obituary, enjoyed talking about pig production and corn yields, and the training of a team of horses named Whitney and Josie, and why Franklin Roosevelt would trounce Herbert Hoover in a November election. They married in June 11th, 1937, and for good measure, they climbed Half Dome in Yosemite on their honeymoon. They were blessed with 2 daughters, wonderful, musically talented daughters who grew up and married and had children. But because life is rarely perfect, and if Ruth's life had been, she probably would never have made it into the sermon written by a female minister in a denomination she'd almost certainly never heard of. Ruth's eldest daughter died of melanoma at the tender age of 27. Ruth's life went on. She and her husband traveled together and enjoyed their retirement. She had a loving and supportive church community in a United Methodist church, where she particularly enjoyed her women's prayer group. She said of this group, "We know each other and trust each other so well, we can share personal problems and hurts." One of those hurts she shared was the death of her husband in 1993. Dr. Edwin Aluzas, who wrote her obituary, noted, "This woman who loved to smile, who always baked her own bread, lovingly labored with Meals on Wheels and knitted sweaters for practically everybody in sight, once wrote in her autobiography about feeling unworthy, not measuring up, and being uncomfortable about being bossy and domineering at times. And having been demeaned by poverty, nevertheless was proud of her family, acknowledging the difference in families and writing for all of us to ponder, quote, "God must love differences. Each and every one of us on the whole earth is different." It reminded me of what Abraham Lincoln once said, "God must have loved ordinary people. He made so many of them." Every person in this room has a balance of joys and sorrows in their lives. In our extraordinary ordinariness, we are born, we are loved, we eat ice cream and watch sunsets. And then too, we get the stomach flu, someone we love dies, we discover our dairy allergies. We live lives of extraordinary joy and quiet desperation, sometimes in the very same day. How do we balance these facts? I know for me, I tend to spend more time in gratitude. All in all, probably not a bad way to go. But sometimes I get overwhelmed. I've discovered for me personally, when I'm feeling most stressed, it is actually helpful to sit down and list all of the things that are stressful. This isn't a to-do list, though I've heard those can be helpful. Instead, I just list everything going on in my life that's big or could be stressful. Even the positive things go on that list, because the list of major life stressors, the one that assigns points to all of these events, the two biggest ones are getting married and having or adopting a child. For me, the beauty of this exercise is that it encourages me to be gentle with myself for a while. Because generally, after I add it all up, I discover that, wow, there is an awful lot going on in my life. An ordinary person would be stressed out by what's happening right now. I am not particularly weak. Anyone would be stressed out by all of this. There's a whole lot of stuff going on. Now, I know that if I were a more advanced human being, I wouldn't need to compare myself to a mystical other in order to allow myself a little sympathy. On the other hand, if I weren't so relentlessly Pollyanna-ish, I might find it easier to spend more time on the shadow side of the spectrum. I am in a stage of my life where the sandwich generation is very, very real. Even though my kids are technically adults, my older one has a lot of chronic health issues and is autistic and may live with me for a good long while still. And as many of you know, my dad and my in-laws are needing a great deal of care, and I worry about them. It's one of those things that is both funny and not funny that my dad and my dog are on the same medications for congestive heart failure. He also takes the same insulin that my cat does. And that my mother-in-law went on hospice care the same week that I left on a cruise with my dad and my sister. But those relationships are also really special. I am glad that I get to spend time with my dad and my in-laws. I feel like I'm setting a good example for my kids. This is how we treat people. And I'm really, really grateful that my kids see that example and that the way that I've parented has worked well for them. My older daughter, Mika, and I had a really sweet interaction the other day. I was driving her to an emergency room to get treatment for a migraine that wasn't going away, something that we've done probably half a dozen times in the past year and a half. I said something kind of smartass, and then said, I hope that I didn't sound dismissive. And she said, Mom, you are the least dismissive person I know. Do you know how many friends I've used your just because someone somewhere has a brain tumor doesn't mean you never get to complain about your headache line on? Yes, I'm doing something right. Maybe it's time to actually believe it. That just because someone somewhere has it worse than you do doesn't mean your stuff isn't hard. Maybe it's time to admit that there are disappointments, pain, sorrow. Yes, probably someone else has it worse than you do. And certainly doing for others is one of the best ways to feel better. But while I always encourage good deeds, this sermon isn't about all the ways we can feel better. This one is encouraging us to spend some time in that shadow place, to feel what's making you feel sad or overwhelmed or bringing you pain. When my first wife and I separated back in 2008, we had 2 young kids and I was still in seminary. We made the best decision for our family at the time and stayed in the same 1,100 square foot house for the next 2 years. But I learned it's kind of hard to grieve a relationship while you're still sharing a bathroom with someone. As the partner who made the decision to leave, I had done a great deal of discernment and a fair amount of grieving before we actually broke up. After this decision, I spent the next several months working, taking care of my kids, setting up a new room in the office, and basically getting through life. I had done enough grieving already so I could be the one who held things together. Imagine my surprise when 6 months later, while in Chicago for my January intensive classes, I found myself grieving. Blatantly, messily, sobbing, grieving. I was clear that this was the right decision for me. That wasn't the issue. I didn't have second thoughts. But what happened was that I had successfully avoided the real work of grieving the loss of the relationship. Suddenly, when given time and space away from my ex-partner and our children, the grief came up and flooded me in a way I hadn't thought would happen. Grief sneaks up on us in ways we don't imagine. I remember a man I spoke with at the hospital when I was doing chaplaincy training. He was a very large man, a workaholic who worked 80 hours a week and didn't take care of himself, and he was in the hospital for heart problems. He was stunned to realize that he was really frightened to be in the ICU because he'd last been there over 6 years ago when his wife died. He thought he was over her death. He was in a new relationship, and he was quite embarrassed to discover that he was reliving the experience. He was both relieved and a little shocked to find that grief bubbles up when we least expect it. It made perfect sense to me that being in the same environment served to trigger those memories. So we need to address the big things, because if we don't, they come back and rear up their ugly heads when we least expect it. Yes. But what about the smaller things? Those little hurts and disappointments that everyone deals with. Those ordinary feelings of pain or loneliness or regret. I encourage you to take the time to be quiet, to rest, to sit with the pain and the shadows. My dad and my parents-in-law are all in their early 80s. And while I know a lot of people in their 80s who are in pretty robust health, this isn't particularly true for my dad or my in-laws. I'm seeing what happens to some folks as they age, and it scares me a little. Getting older is not for the weak. But it's also a time of happiness. Studies show that adults have the highest sense of happiness and well-being from ages 65 to 79. Does that surprise anybody? Shirley Sage is looking forward to this. The anxiety of the 40s and 50s over paying college tuition and taking care of kids and aging parents, often while you're still working, make that life stage the least happy. Happiness goes in this kind of curve like this. Sort of fascinating. But feelings of satisfaction and well-being increase in that early retirement age. Partly because there are fewer stressors. Partly, I'm guessing, because one of the great gifts of aging is not caring quite as much what other people think of us. Exactly. We no longer have to look good all the time. We kind of just are who we are, and there's something freeing about that, right? As we age and deal with the losses that inevitably come with getting older, let's make space to grieve. And let us remember that we do not have to be good. We just have to let the soft animal of our body love what it loves. Don't get lost in those feelings unless you want to, but it's okay to feel them. Grief deferred doesn't get transformed, it just sits there like a rock in the pit of your stomach. Feel your feelings. Let yourself be sad sometimes. Let it be okay. Blessed be.